This program is made possible in part by Cerisi Conlon, LLP, protecting the future and using the law as a force for good in both the courtroom and our communities. Online at cerisiconlon.com.
Hello and welcome. Well, in Minneapolis and St. Paul, we have a woman who is an international leader and expert in the arena of trauma and loss, and she is a pioneer in terms of her work with the big concept of ambiguous loss. Pauline Boss is my guest. She's back. She's been on before, one of my favorite persons to learn from, and she's written a new book that I want to give you a peek at. It's got an intriguing title, The Myth of Closure, Ambiguous Loss in a Time of Pandemic and Change. We're taping on December 5th, 2022, so it's very, very timely as we are still in the pandemic and we're looking forward and back. So here's a peek at the book. And welcome, Pauline.
Thank you, Mary.
Yes.
It's a pleasure.
It's great to see you again. For those who haven't read your books, you've written 8. Tell us how you, in a nutshell, define ambiguous loss.
Well, simply put, ambiguous loss is just an unclear loss. It's not death, because with that you have a death certificate and you have medical evidence that there has been a transformation from, as they say, from breath to air. With ambiguous loss, you have no facts. There are 2 kinds of ambiguous loss. The first is physical, where the body is missing, where the person is missing. So they're physically absent, but kept psychologically present because the family still is focused on finding them. The second kind is psychological ambiguous loss, and that is when the person is there, such as when they have dementia, but not there. So they're present but absent. So it's kind of a paradoxical kind of loss, and very confusing, but very common.
Yes, I'm guessing very common. And you've been around the world working with groups and communities, countries, after some major losses like 9/11, Pauline, right? The tsunami in Japan.
Yes.
The fairly recent apartment collapse in Florida.
Yes.
Terrified everyone living in a high rise. How do those losses all fit into ambiguous loss in your
Well, there
way
are
of
also
thinking?
deaths that happen at those same kinds of catastrophes. But for example, I'm working now with therapists in Ukraine, and they have clear-cut deaths, of course, but more so they have ambiguous losses because, for one thing, the men stayed behind to fight and the women and children left. They don't know where each other are. Some women stayed to fight too, by the way. But also there are bodies, and people don't have the ability to recognize who they are and connect them to their family. So what they told me, they have an epidemic of ambiguous loss there.
You know, that makes so much sense. I hadn't really applied this concept to that, but of course, and I'm guessing in almost every war, there would be ambiguous loss.
And that's where my first research was in the mid-1970s with the families of the men missing in action in Vietnam, Southeast Asia.
That's right.
Yes.
Speaking of loss, and before we go any further, I'm guessing a lot of you knew that Pauline was married to a real treasure in our Midwest culture. Dudley Riggs was your husband, and he died in 2021.
2020.
2020, Pauline.
September of 2020.
Yes.
Yes.
So you wrote this book while dealing with his death, correct?
Well, I finished it. I had started it before, but he was not able to walk anymore, and so I needed to take care of him, and I set it aside. So I think I first started in 2015, actually.
Oh, wow.
But I set it aside, and then he died, and the pandemic happened, and the book changed. It changed its nature. It is more personal, and also I moved Ambiguous Loss to the global situation more than to families and couples. So it, things happen, and sometimes it's a good thing that there are delays.
Well, there had to be some therapeutic benefit to writing the book or having a big task to kind of give you reasons to get up in the morning.
Oh, dear, yes.
I'm guessing.
Yes,
Yeah.
I was grieving, and I was alone, except for a granddaughter who was also alone, so we could visit each other. And other than that, I had nothing to do. I was no longer a caregiver. And so I picked the book up again. And it did give me purpose, something to do, and something I like to do. I like to write. And also it kept me thinking at another level, because meanwhile, I think there were hundreds of requests for Zooms and podcasts and interviews, because people were curious, and I was surprised. They would say to me, "Is this an ambiguous loss, what we're experiencing now?" And of course they were right. The pandemic brought many ambiguous losses. The loss of trust in the world as a safe place, the not being able to hug, your elders who were dying in a hospital or be with them, kids not having graduations and proms, and the markers of life, the rituals, no weddings, no funerals. It was a strange, strange time.
And it does continue too in a less dramatic, less horrible way, but don't you feel that we're not out of it, are we?
No, we're not out of it, nor I think will we ever be. There won't be any closure on the pandemic.
Thinking of that
my father
concept.
was a child during the 1918 pandemic, and he talked about it the rest of his life.
Did he?
And also he had pneumonia a lot because it had harmed his lungs.
Had he been a soldier?
No, he was a child. He was about 13 during that time, during the pandemic of 1918.
But so he got sick.
He got he had the flu in
Yes,
1918.
Okay.
And then he had the physical residual of it the rest of his life, but he also spoke of it a lot. And we will too. And the youngsters today will too. They'll tell their grandchildren about it too. There will be no closure on the pandemic. It was epic in its impact, both of death and of ambiguous losses. For all we lost, our lives changed.
Do you think we learned anything from the 1918 epidemic that was able to be picked up in this
I'm not sure.
pandemic?
I'm not sure because, for one thing, science was with us this time, thank God. And they did it in record speed and came up with vaccines. That was not true in 1918, though the flu shot we take every year is a residual from the 1918 flu, but they did not have it to use back then. So I think science made the difference this time. And also, the difference is that there was a division in the country of people who could tolerate ambiguity, like We don't know what this virus is, but it's taking control of our lives. Some people can't tolerate that kind of uncertainty. And so many of them just fall into absolutist thinking. It's a hoax. It doesn't exist. I don't need a mask. And so we had divisions between the people who could say, I don't like this, but I'm going to tolerate wearing a mask. I'm going to wait for the vaccine, and when it's out, I'll have it. So that's oddly how the country divided.
When you explain it like that, it helps a person understand perhaps some of the behavior that, if one is a mask wearer, feels almost like rebellion or counter attack or something. You know, it's a dramatic thing for people.
To not wear it.
Right, right.
Yes.
So, but understanding that perhaps it's because of fear, that they're out of control.
Well, yes, and
that kind of helps.
You're out of control when something is ambiguous. And, you know, this virus that was surrounding us, we didn't even know what to call it at first. I mean, it took a while, but it was speedy, I thought, nevertheless. But if people can't tolerate not knowing the answer to a problem, then they just shut it down. And that's what closure is. They shut it down and say, this is what it is, even if it's not true. So when I was writing about closure and the tolerance for ambiguity, tolerance for ambiguous loss, it occurred to me that it's cultural, and that we have a lot of people who like to think in the binary, win, lose, good, bad.
Either or
thinking. And it didn't work during the pandemic to keep you safe.
Is that another loss then, in a sense, for the country, for families? It is, isn't it?
The division, absolutely. And it has caused a lot of family alienation, where family members don't agree with each other, and so they cut off. More ambiguous loss then. And it's like we have to try and talk with each other, even though we don't agree. Fortunately, I have a brother with whom I don't agree on many areas, but we both lost our little brother of polio the summer before the Salk vaccine came out. So he believes in vaccinations. Believe me, he does, and his whole family does, as do I. And so we were on common ground there.
So you look for common ground if you're experiencing uncommon ground, right?
And we have common ground on talking about our children, talking about food, sometimes talking about sports, but we don't have common ground on politics and religion. But I still love him, and he loves me, and we still get together. It's what I call a good enough relationship.
Oh, that's a good way to put it. Not perfect,
no,
not flawed, but good enough.
And I don't believe in cutoffs in families unless, of course, there's terrible abuse. I believe we should tolerate the people we don't agree with, if possible, even if it's a little bit, because otherwise it's another ambiguous loss.
And we have enough losses in life,
already.
Don't we?
Already.
Some of the more regular type losses: divorce, changing jobs, moving out of your home, losing a pet. I mean, you think of loss, and the list gets long real fast, doesn't it?
Those are ambiguous losses, yes. Divorce is, by its very nature, causes ambiguous losses for the children, where they have parents, but they're not always physically present. Like the non-custodial parent may be ambiguously lost for a week. Maybe they have them on weekends. Adoption is another one. And there are experts who have done the research on ambiguous loss and divorce, ambiguous loss and adoption, ambiguous loss and foster kids. These are all areas now that are being used. Also, families where a child is transitioning. The child who's transitioning doesn't have a loss, but the parents apparently do, and friends, because they're not the way they used to be.
Right.
So there's a body
maybe
of
expectations must change. Their dreams maybe change.
Yes.
Sure, that makes sense.
Yes.
So many things fit into your structure.
But remember, I don't do that research. I developed the theory of ambiguous loss, but these pods of different researches are being done around the world by other people.
Right, right. But you kind of, you're the engine. You use racism in the book as another major example of an ambiguous loss. And up until this book, I don't think you had looked at such broad cultural or, universal themes with the concept. Tell us just a little bit about how racism fits into being an ambiguous loss.
Well, you're right that this is the first book in which I raised the ambiguous loss theory to a global level. Mm-hmm. And it came to me during the pandemic and, of course, the George Floyd killing, which was very close to where I live. And the wonderful video that was taken by Darnella Fraser, for which, by the way, she got a Pulitzer.
I know.
For citizen journalism, which she deserves.
She changed history, didn't she?
She changed history, and she opened the eyes of, she certainly opened my eyes. Indeed, they should have been opened before, but she made me see the picture in a more stark light that something is not right here and has to change. And so with racism, the ambiguous loss started hundreds of years ago when slave families were sold apart from one another on the auction block. They couldn't even have a family, and their children would be sold away from them. And we now know that that kind of trauma from that kind of loss can be passed on down through the generations, so that fear of trust in the world, not having trust in the world as a safe place, is something that's passed down. Indeed, resilience was passed down too, but now they're finding out that black families are having what's called a weathering of the immune system because they're expected to be resilient all the time.
Now, weathering, what does that mean, Pauline?
It wears it down. It ages the immune system.
I
and
see,
causes
sure.
an earlier death.
Sure, yes. Oh, that's, I know we hear so much about African American families having more high blood pressure issues, more heart issues,
That's what
etc.
that's about.
And that would be
They're now
part of that
connecting
trauma that's inherited then,
Well,
in the sense.
it's not quite inherited. It's epigenetic is what the word is. It doesn't come down through the gene, but it comes down through what turns the gene on.
Not through culture as much as
Well, that's the old
biology, nature versus
Yeah,
nurture.
isn't that true?
Yeah,
And I suspect it'll end up still being both.
some of each.
But this is new. This epigenetics is new research. It's, in fact, a rather new field.
That's fascinating.
And they're finding out that trauma can be passed on down through the generations, through whatever it is that turns the genes on.
Wow. That's really combining nature and nurture,
It
right?
is.
Boom, there, isn't it?
There you go.
And
Absolutely.
so we have the pandemic with a heightened awareness of racism that is out of control in our country. They're layered together, aren't they?
Yes.
And adding to the anxiety, the stress, right?
And the lack of health care and the lack of
Right.
insurance and the lack of the food that's needed, the lack of transportation that's needed, it just shed a light on the disparities in our culture that still are too great, absolutely too great.
Do you think out of this awareness that we're maybe some of us slowly getting, others understanding better, will there be some good change happening that we can look back maybe someday and say, had it not been for that pandemic and that racial crisis, it would be a slower road forward?
I agree. I
Do you
think
think-
the answer is yes. I'm an optimist, but also I was trained by a psychiatrist that said you have to shake the family up in order for it to change.
Oh, that's
Well, now we
interesting.
have a global family.
Right.
Has been shaken up
Yes.
by an epic virus, an epic situation of close down and of everything changing. Everything was different than it had been before. And so what usually comes after that, we've had periods like that in the past, what usually comes after a big war or epidemic or the depression, something happens out of the chaos that brings about change for the better.
Yeah.
And of course, we don't know if this change will be for the better, but we're in a process of change right now, which is very stressful and full of ambiguity. Those of us who are more able to tolerate uncertainty and ambiguity are not as stressed as people who want certainty, because there's not much certainty around right now still.
Right. You write that resilience is, in a way, greatly influenced by finding meaning,
Right.
and that was interesting.
The meaning for me now is that we're in a period of chaos and still change, elections and so on, and the economy shifting, war. We have the potential of war that is frightening. A nuclear plant has become weaponized in Ukraine by the Russians. Lots of things are at the cliff's edge, so to speak, right now. And we hope that they come out all right and move to something better. The young people are concerned, of course, about climate change.
Right.
And I support them wholeheartedly. We must do something about that. And so that's on the table too, and on the cliff's edge. So right now, if people are feeling anxious and even a little sad now and then, it's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation.
So don't beat yourself up about it,
Right,
right?
exactly.
If you're feeling
Exactly.
what's wrong with me. We only have a few minutes left, but the book's title, The Myth of Closure, I've got to ask you a
Okay.
little bit more about that. You say in the book that popular understanding is that there is closure after loss.
In the United States.
In our country.
But nowhere else.
That's so interesting. So tell us more in the next few minutes that we've got.
Unfortunately, perhaps because we're a very mastery and solution-oriented society, we aren't very fond of watching suffering, and we do deny death according to some people. You can't cure it, so we're not interested in it. And when people are suffering or having a death in the family and grieving, there's a tendency to say, well, we'll give you a week and then come back to work and you'll be over it, and that there's closure. No one else in the world believes in that. The Eastern cultures have ancestral worship. The Thai restaurant down the street from me, they put a plate in the window for their ancestors who are long gone. In Mexico, they have the Day of the Dead every year. And what we need to do, and the research shows now, that when you lose somebody you care about, there's no need for closure. You learn to live with the loss, and you can live with the loss. In fact, it's easier than thinking you have to get over it.
So if you feel you have to get over it, you are expending energy trying to stuff your true
Exactly.
feelings, probably,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
I think that's a very comforting concept for people to hear, Pauline, because, I mean, I think it's so universal that people think, well, after about a year, you should be back to normal. You know?
Yes. It's an idea that should be given up. The word closure is a perfectly good word in real estate deals, but it's a bad word to use in human relationships. Yes.
That's very, very important to hear. Well, you've got a passage that I'd like to have you close with.
Okay.
Do you want to read? This is from the very end of the book, right?
It is. It is. Divided as we are, I see renewed energy in the will of many to do the right thing in our country, not just for themselves, but for the survival of the human family. Continued thinking about the absolute of closure blocks not only our self-understanding, but also our ability to empathize with the suffering of others. If we believe that people experiencing loss should just get over it, then we have to shut down our own ability to feel, and we're terribly alone. May we have the courage of flexibility to change. May the pandemic virus and its variants become manageable, less deadly. May more people pay attention to facts, get vaccinated, have their children vaccinated. And finally, may those of us whose loved ones died during this time never again be told we need to find closure.
What a perfect way to end this interview. I don't like to end it, but that gives us hope, that gives us ideas.
Yes.
And it really sums up the book, doesn't it?
It does.
It
There
does
is
us
hope.
A great, great summary. Well, thank you so much for coming down and sharing with us this really profound understanding that you have that
It's
I
my
think
pleasure.
we'll all benefit from.
It's my pleasure, Mary. Thank you.
See you. Thank you for being with us. I'll be back again next week. Until then, have a good week.